Hey, this is Seth Parnell, the minister at the Portia Church of Christ, and this is the midweek Bible study. This is about, I think this is episode 29, and we're so glad that you are here to study with us and to be with us. We want to know that your presence is always appreciated, and we hope that you can participate in this study. And we hope this is something that benefits you and lifts you up. We always want to encourage you to join us if you can. Right now at Portia, we are meeting on Sunday mornings and on Wednesday nights. You can at a Sunday morning at 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock, and on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. And so we hope if you're in the area, you can join us, because we'd love to get to know you, get to talk to you, and be able to worship with you as well. We're located at 307 South Jackson Street in Portia, Arkansas. And so if you get the chance, we hope that you can come see us sometime. We have a good episode here coming up, because we have a special guest. We have Michael Foresha from the Nettleton congregation. He's here with us, and I know you're going to appreciate his perspective. Very, very knowledgeable guy, and so I know that you're going to enjoy what he has to bring here. But Michael, why don't you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you've been doing?
Okay. As you already know, you already, gave him my name, so I can save that time. But yes, we're located here at the Nettleton congregation. We were, I think about a year where we were away from the area. We went out to North Carolina, but we're now back and getting the work started here. Our hearts and prayers are with everyone else who's kind of suffering through the COVID and trying to make sure we're spiritually being fed and that we're doing what God wants us to do while we're also being careful. So I appreciate all of you and glad for those that are tuning in to be with us. As far as in what I've been up to, it's probably the same, trying to do what I can, preaching and teaching. But I appreciate this opportunity. I do appreciate the works you're doing, Seth, and the works in Portia. I'm just glad that I could be a part of it this evening.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time to join us here. What have you been preaching on lately down there in Nettleton?
Well, some of the lessons that we've been working on is, I guess, some of my own frustrations, as well as all the rest of us, is we kind of feel like our hands are tied during this time because we're doing our best to assemble, but I'm still trying to find a way that we can encourage others, as far as that word we sometimes don't like to use of evangelism. And I've been trying to look at lessons on that topic. One that I preached here recently, the title on encouragement is to go deeper in our own studies, as well as in perhaps our relationship with others. That the one thought that I've been trying to work with is we're calling and checking on people anyway to see how they're doing physically. And I think we could also just remind them, that the Lord still loves them and that they can do their part in studying and trying to make sure they're right with Him.
It sounds like some good lessons, and we always, it's always a good thing to hear, good lessons from the Word of God, because we know that's, as preachers, I always say that we don't have to do the hard part, because God's already given us, the word to speak. He's given us the scriptures, and so. But it's always encouraging to hear good lessons, and so I know the people down there at Nettleton probably thank a lot of you already, and for the work you're doing. We always want to encourage you if you have any questions or comments throughout the study to please put them down, and we'd love to get to them and have you participate in the study and just join with us as we study the Bible. We've had several people here that already have chimed in that say that they are listening. We have Brenda Willard. She says hello, and it's good to have you here. We have Gail Dunlap, Tom and Billy Gale, and she says thanks, and the Dunlaps are watching. Tom's an elder here at Portia, and so it's good to have him and Billy Gale with us. We have Janet Deloche has chimed in; she's here, and Dave Lawrence. He says thank you, Seth, and thank you, Michael. He's got both of us in there, and so
appreciate that.
Appreciate what Dave does. He's a good guy. Sarah Whaley here. She goes to Portia. She's appreciate your presence here, as well as Pat McIntyre. Pat and Wayne are here joining with us, and Donna Harris. And so we appreciate all of you being here, joining us tonight, and hope this is something that can build you up and that can do you some good. Our study for tonight, if you have a Bible at home, is going to be mainly in Luke chapter 19. Luke chapter 19. There's a lot of interesting interactions that Jesus had with people. Jesus was someone who he didn't just speak to crowds and give instruction to large groups of people, but oftentimes we find Jesus, on an individual level, being someone who will talk to a simple person, and an individual person. We see that with the woman at the well. We see that, in some of his interactions with the disciples, with Nicodemus, and so we know that Jesus often took time in order to just to talk to people, personally. That was something that he did. And in this case here in Luke chapter 19, we find another case in where Jesus takes the time to talk to one single person. And this man, his name is Zacchaeus. And most of us are from the Vacation Bible School song than we are maybe from a study of what goes down here. But this is actually a very, very interesting story, about how Jesus interacts with the type of person that Zacchaeus was. And so we're going to take a look at this story and try maybe dig into maybe some things we can learn from it, things that we can apply from it ourselves. But Michael, what is your first thoughts when you read this story? I think this mainly goes from verses 1 through 10 there in Luke 19. But what are just maybe your introductory thoughts when you first read this story?
Well, it's interesting, and you had mentioned the song that we usually sing at VBS, and it's such a kind of a bright spot, uplifting. But then as you take that song, we think about this wee little man, and that's kind of where my thoughts start. As soon as the name Zacchaeus is mentioned, my mind went directly to that song. But then when you start reading through the account, as you're reading through, you find out that Zacchaeus was a publican, a tax collector. So now we have this cheerful song, and then we find out that he was a tax collector, and he was despised by everyone. So then we have this kind of conflict already of like, I like that great little song, but now I'm going to have to deal with this individual who we're going to notice that there's more to the story, I guess you would say, where we start out and what we think about with the name, this wee little man and all of this. And then we're going to be also introduced as you read verses 1 through 10. Verse 10 is actually the verse that we usually quote or read to discuss what the mission of Jesus actually was as he came to this earth, as it reads, "For the Son of Man has come to seek and save that." We immediately are old, and when we take this wee little man, we find out that no going to teach us a great lesson.
Yeah, it's interesting that sometimes when you look at characters in the Bible and see what they're remembered for, and what they're known for. When I think of people like maybe like Ehud, most of the time when you think of Ehud the judge, you think of, well, he was left-handed. He was the left-handed judge. And sometimes there's some, when you think of Jonah, there's more to Jonah's story. But when we think of Jonah, where do we go to first? Usually he was
Sure.
swallowed by the big fish. And so usually when I think of Zacchaeus, like you mentioned, I think, well, he was short. He was a short guy. But I think there's definitely lessons that we can get, from the story when we kind of go beyond to that exterior layer, because he was a tax collector, a publican, and not only that, but he was a chief, tax collector.
Sure.
So he was, in the eyes of some, he may have been, the worst of the worst. He's a his reputation was not something that you would envy as a person down there then. And so Zacchaeus was he was not someone that maybe you would expect to have an interest, in Jesus. But yet we find here Jesus comes in the area, and what does Zacchaeus do? He goes out and he climbs up a tree in order to see Jesus, and which is maybe it's a lot. It's more effort than you would think a man like Zacchaeus would put into to listen to what Jesus had to say, and so it's not only is it interesting to see how Jesus approached Zacchaeus, but it's also interesting to see how Zacchaeus responded to this and how you know how he sought out what Jesus was teaching. And so I think just one of the first things that comes to mind once I read through the story, once I think about it for a while, just one of the first things that I think of is just the way that Jesus approaches people, and that's something that maybe
Oh, sure.
we'll get into a little bit later. But he had a past the exterior and seeing a person for who they were, and that's that's something that we could take an example from.
Sure. Yeah, I wanted, if you don't mind, I'll pick up on that, of really of how Jesus looks at Zacchaeus. And one of the things that occurred to me, I was looking at the different publicans that are mentioned. Of course, we know that Matthew was a publican, kind of, with being called, seemed, I guess we could use the word abandon his post and went and followed Jesus, much like the fishermen. But we're introduced to Matthew. We have Zacchaeus is a publican, but then we're also reminded of the publican and Pharisee in that parable with the prayer. But in each one of the cases, we go into it, the publicans, and no one likes them. They're Jewish, but they're employed by the Rome, that whole background. But when you look at the individuals, the examples we have is, again, we have to get past that exterior or our preconceived notions of what we think they're going to be like. I mean, sure, we can read the accounts where they weren't favored because they were what? Some of the material goes as far just to call them traitors. They're Jewish people working for the Romans. Of course, we find out even here in Luke 19 that there wasn't always honest business practices, that they seem to take a little extra in the tolls and the taxes. But again, we run into these same problems where perhaps that initial, whether it's by sight or what we've heard, that initial impression, and we have to do better as we look at our example, that of our Lord, and how he deals with this man who he just seems to cross paths with him. And I don't want to lead this as this was some chance meeting, because there's another example where Jesus seems to be outside of the area or traveling through. And you had mentioned the woman at the well in John 4. It also says that he must go through Samaria. So even though it's a different area or it's a name that comes up that we're looking at, again, we're reminded of the mission of Jesus to seek and save the lost. wherever they might be, and whoever they are. Um, One of the things too that came to mind in looking over Luke 19 is that thought of where was Jesus headed at this time? And it's really interesting because I thought about my own self. We do that. We can reflect upon, we kind of put ourselves into this setting. And the book of John provides us with many examples where, if you go all the way back to John chapter 2, when Jesus is at the wedding and his mother asked him to fix the problem, you remember they ran out of refreshments there. And he makes the statement that his hour had not come. And you can run that reference through the book of John. And when you get up to John chapter 12, Jesus said his hour has come. And what he's looking at is it's time now for him to move towards Jerusalem. And I thought about that for a moment, and Jesus is preparing for the end, the end of his physical life. We're going to see as he enters Jerusalem and all of the accounts that we have of him in Gethsemane and his arrest and all that. But this episode, as he goes through Jericho, is on the way there. And there are many times I know that perhaps our own patience runs short, where we don't think about, hey, can I stop and maybe invite someone to church? This is the thoughts that were going through my mind. Jesus is headed for Jerusalem, and he's already predicted and prophesied all the terrible things that are going to happen when he gets there. But now he's going through Jericho, and here's this, as we sing, the wee little man up in a tree, and he's going to take time out not only to speak to him, but to actually go to his home and have more of the one-on-one of the teaching. And again, that's a great example for us. Like you said, this is kind of that VBS-based song, but once we start reading, there is so much more here for us to learn from.
Yeah, there's definitely, maybe like layers to it, but that's to think about. We know that Jesus, he wasn't surprised, by the events of the cross. So he knew that was coming. He knew that was his purpose, for being down here, on this earth. And you kind of think, like if I was in that position, maybe if you were dreading something in the future, you might not be looking for opportunities, to do something good. But Jesus was able to do that, even though he knew what was going to happen. He still kept his eyes open for maybe a person in a tree who needed to hear what he had to say. And but we know that he was traveling. I think it says from Jericho to Jerusalem, and of course we know Jerusalem it's the capital city. It's where the crucifixion, the trial, and everything went down. And usually when we think of Jericho, we think of Joshua who fought the Battle of Jericho, another VBS song that we sing. But it's it was a very actually it was a very affluent city. It was a lot of riches were in Jericho, and so that area was a pretty ideal place for, if you were a chief tax collector, it'd be a pretty ideal place to live. But we know Jesus was always traveling. He said, the foxes have holes, the birds have nests, but the Son of Man doesn't have anywhere to lay his head. He was always traveling. He was always moving, and and so we know he's moving through this area, and he has this encounter with Zacchaeus, and there may have been there probably may have been more what we might consider maybe more important things to do that we might consider at that time, but yet Jesus, he had a different perspective on what to do. And so he comes here, and there's a lot of people around him, but yet he singles out this one man, which I think is pretty interesting. But like you said, he was headed towards Jerusalem, and that was he knew what was going to happen there. And that's kind of it's interesting to see how he viewed that. And we know, from the Garden of Gethsemane, we know that he understood the pain that was about to happen, and he said, not my will but yours. But still, he, on the way there, on that journey there, he found ways to do good. And so, what do you, but still, there was if you kind of switch, the perspective, over to Zacchaeus, we know that he was a very well-to-do guy, but there was also a lot of maybe obstacles that he faced as far as coming to the gospel and hearing what Jesus had to say. And you could take a look at that from different angles. But in your mind, what were some of the obstacles that Zacchaeus faced as far as being someone who was going to hear the words of life and really become a Christian by listening to what Jesus had to say?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up with the obstacles. When I was reading through and reminding myself about what's in each verse, there's the physical obstacles stand out. You don't usually think of this as an obstacle, but the popularity of Jesus becomes an obstacle, and that's why Zacchaeus has to find the tree, because the crowds were there and they were all pressing in and all, I'm not sure if there was announcements that Jesus was coming, his disciples traveling ahead of him or any of that, but the crowds knew it. And so you have that, I think some of the wording is, a throng or a multitude of people, and they're pressing, and that's why Zacchaeus is going to have some difficulties. And then not only is he dealing with, say, the popularity of Jesus, but we also have to remember that he himself, though, as you've been pointing out, and I appreciate you mentioning it, he was a wealthy individual. But even though he was a chief publican and was a wealthy individual, he is still not in public favor. So you have this large crowd. He's a small man, as we know and we sing about. So he's dealing with the popularity, so the status of Jesus, his own status. He's dealing with his own stature. But then, and this was some of the things when you talk about, I don't want to say it's an obstacle on the spiritual side, but I know from many conversations that I've had, and this is different individuals and different age brackets, there's that somewhat of a fear when we're inviting them and they maybe want to, attend a Sunday morning worship or a Wednesday night Bible study for the first time, and that thoughts of, am I going to fit in? And Zacchaeus brings this out because he knows, even though he's successful in his works and holds probably a prominent place in Jericho, he doesn't fit in there on the physical side. And now looking at, is he going to fit in? I mean, when we look at the account, Zacchaeus is really just looking for the opportunity. He just wants to see Jesus. He's not thinking anywhere beyond that. He's thinking that here's the Son of God. Everyone's, pressing out into the streets to see him. And Zacchaeus is just looking for an opportunity that perhaps he can climb up a tree, that he can actually just lay eyes on Jesus. And as we know, reading the account, it's going to go much farther than that. But the obstacle that stands out, that perhaps is in many people's minds, I'm not with that group. Am I going to fit in? And that's what Zacchaeus reminds us of. And it's a great reminder, too, for each one of us. Not so much that someone feels that way, but we have to do our part and make sure that people feel comfortable.
Yeah, and you can kind of tell that, especially with what he brings up after Jesus. He starts talking to him, and he starts talking about if he has wronged anybody, he will give them back. I think it was fourfold. He will he will repay any wrongdoing that he done. He was quick to point that out. But that's a very good point, because the because we may not think about that, when we're maybe like when we're inviting somebody, or when somebody becomes a Christian, or becomes listens to the gospel. That's usually a pretty it's a big decision, and then sometimes a it's a big decision to make, as far as, like you said, in fitting in with a group of people. And we should always try to be some of the most welcoming people on this earth, and try to make sure people know that they have a place in the church. The church is something that welcomes anybody who would come to obedience in the gospel. And we would and so to send that message, that there's a song that we sing that's called the gospel is for all. We know that that's a message that we should maybe broadcast more. But yeah, it can be difficult to fit into a new situation, especially with your upbringing, and your maybe your background is something that may seem like it's in contradiction or opposed to this new lifestyle that you're trying to live. And but we know that Paul talks about how the gospel is something that transforms us. It's something that creates somebody new. And so we know that as we'll learn here, you're from Zacchaeus. The past that a person has, it doesn't have to be something that completely defines their life, but the gospel has the power to change a person's life, and to give it a new and fresh start. And that's something that is pretty special about the gospel, and to note that. But we know that of course, when we think of the physical barriers that he had, you imagine no one was probably opening doors for Zacchaeus. He his the reputation that he had was one of that people looked down upon him, and maybe for a good reason, because we understand that as you mentioned, I think previously, collectors were not always above board, but they were often looked at as cheats, and as people who would collect more taxes than they needed to in order to pocket the extra. We know the Romans were only concerned about getting what they required, and they didn't care if any extra was taken off of that. But they didn't have the greatest a reputation, and so no one was going to help Zacchaeus. At least it doesn't seem like anybody was interested in helping Zacchaeus you know uh, press forward. But yet he was able to overcome that obstacle. But I think the last thing that I thought of when taking a look at obstacles that Zacchaeus had was kind of similar to reputation, but it was the expectation of what he was supposed to do. Because oftentimes, if people expect us to not go to do something wrong, or to just fall into the crowd, it's easy to do that. If no one's expecting you to go above board, and to do something good, then it's easy to just let that slide. You know,
Oh, sure.
no one expected Zacchaeus to be the type of person to seek out spiritual help, seek out the gospel. And he could have just gone with that, but yet he defied those expectations and climbed that tree, and was able to put in the effort that it takes in order to hear the gospel. And
Sure.
I think that's one of the defining things of his character.
Sure. Oh, that's with you bringing up the term expectation. I was thinking, usually when we try in our preaching and teaching, and we try and define that concept of hope, from a biblical perspective, so that we're not giving the impression that it's kind of the wishful thinking, like we all joke and say, I hope I get a new car tomorrow. But we usually define it as desire plus expectation. And I was thinking that with Zacchaeus, because here's what I was really trying to work on and trying to think through. Okay, we know that he had a desire to see Jesus. He proves that in his actions, that he's not going to be stuck in the crowd. He's not going to wait. No, I missed it. He's willing. He puts forth great effort, as you were mentioning, to get to a tree, to climb up. But I was wondering with that of, he has the desire. And I'm wrestling with, did he actually have the expectation? Like, I'm going to get to see Jesus. And that's the part that we're not sure of. And I think the account, as Luke records it, shows kind of his surprise that when Jesus actually introduces himself to Zacchaeus, doesn't have to ask his name. We know as the Son of God that his knowledge is far beyond ours. But when you look at the account, so he's got desire. Does he have the expectation that he's actually going to get to see Jesus? And then as it unfolds, we know that it goes far beyond even anything we expect, just with a casual reading. And then the other part, though, that I do enjoy and I'm impressed with Zacchaeus is he's willing to put forth the effort. It wasn't, as you were pointing out, well, no one's going to expect him to do it, or, oh, he's just, this guy or that. He always does this. But he's putting forth a full effort, that he's getting this encounter with Christ. As we've already mentioned, this is not an ideal time. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. We know what awaits him there. But he gets this encounter, and he's at least putting forth all of his efforts to make sure. And again, up to the point where Jesus calls out his name, his expectation was, I just want to be able to see him as he goes past. And it kind of brings us back, this Jesus calling out to him. Uh, there's a lot of lessons that we need to probably take a moment, meditate on, pray about, and then put them into practice. And really how Jesus sees this publican, someone who's despised. I mean, right after he calls out to Zacchaeus, we're going to see that the people in the crowd are arguing with it, like, oh, look what he's doing. But we need to be mindful of that, because what was it, 1 Samuel 16, where Samuel learned the lesson? God wasn't looking at the exterior of the person, but looking at the heart. So Jesus went beyond the wealth that Zacchaeus had accumulated, went beyond whether he was short, tall, any of these physical things. And Jesus was looking at a man's heart that had put forth, had a desire, had expectation, and put forth great effort. We're just in the opportunity just to see Jesus as he went past. And it's also, maybe there are things, I recall I was in attendance with a friend as he was preaching, and he was in a larger city, and on his PowerPoints, he was putting the page number in the Bible for the references. And at first I thought, what do you put the page number? But he explained to me after that, he said many of the people that come, we probably take it for granted. There's a Bible on our table, there's a Bible on our desk, maybe one by our bed. But many of the people that we're going out and inviting today do not have all of that same upbringing and the thoughts of that their Bible is their friend, and you should be reading it. So what he was trying to do was to make it more comfortable for them, so that it wasn't that, I'm sure you can remember the first time that the preacher called out a book and chapter, and you were looking at the index to see what page it was on, to get there. And he was trying to take that discomfort away. And there's a lot of those things that we can do if we take to heart what we're learning here about Jesus, that he didn't look at how much money was in the bank account. He didn't look at how many friends this man had. He was despised. He was a cheap publican. And I don't believe Jesus saw a wee little man, as the song goes, up in a tree, but he saw a heart that was desiring to know God. And it's a great refresher for us in that respect.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's it, he did have that, that desire, to see Jesus, and I agree with you. I don't think he ever dreamed that Jesus would take note of him, because one thing I like to point out is, if you try to think of the people that were there, before Jesus got there, if you were trying to live a righteous life, before Jesus got there, who would you follow? You'd follow the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, because they were the spiritual leaders. And so that's the example that he probably had in his mind of what a spiritual leader, would be like. And I think we know from reading throughout the Gospels that if one of the Pharisees was walking there, he would have never taken any note of who Zacchaeus was, because maybe from the story that Jesus tells about the Pharisee and the publican, he thanks God that he didn't make him into someone like that. And so
Sure.
that's the image of a spiritual leader that Zacchaeus has, and he is shocked, when Jesus actually notices him and
Yeah.
talks to him and invites him to eat with him. And
Right.
we know that Jesus, he did this, on occasion. He is often criticized for it, eating with sinners and with, people who weren't considered, spiritual. But that's who Jesus was. That's a way in which he saw people. And it's cool to think, the uh, that you might think it was maybe risky, for Jesus, because we know that he was criticized, for this. It might not be the best, on the surface, the best, public relations, move that Jesus
Right.
can make, but yet spiritually it was the right move, because
Sure.
uh, because we know Zacchaeus, he showed that desire, and he wanted. You kind of get a sense he wanted to be a better person. I don't. I'm not entirely sure, when we read about him wanting to make things right. I don't know if he was an honest man in a dishonest line of work, or if he was someone who was just willing to put his past behind him and go forward. Uh, but kind of like you said, if we see someone that has a desire to become a better person, a desire to know the gospel, to become a Christian, we should do whatever we can to take away some of that uh, maybe try to take away some of the confusion, and just be there for them and talk
Sure.
to them as a person. And that's what Jesus did. And Paul, he told his readers, that he wrote to, he told them to imitate me, as I imitate Christ. Christ is the ultimate example that we have to follow. And I think that shows in this story that we read about Zacchaeus. And so when we and so it's thinking I think it's pretty important to see that Jesus, he saw past the exterior. He saw past all of the, maybe the outside, but yet he was looking inward. And like you referenced, Samuel. Samuel was someone who was trying to pick a king, for Israel, and he was picking the tallest,
Andy?
the biggest guys, and and then that was not the right decision. Oh, did we lose him? Are you there, Michael? Oh, I think we lost him. Well, I definitely want to know, for all of you who are watching, I definitely want to know maybe what you get out of the story, and maybe what's the one thing really uh, that really jumps out to you about this story of Zacchaeus, and how it maybe some lessons that you get and that you can apply out of it.
Kanze.
Oh, we'll get this. We'll get
Like
this sorted out here.
It won't go.
Oh.
No, it wasn't you, Michaela. What do I need to do?
All right. We have several other people here. We got Linda Kirk has chimed in. She says hi, and also David Huston. It's good to have you here as well, and I hope that everything is going well for you. And let's see. Let's come back here. Yeah, there we go. All right. We'll get that sorted out. You can also tell about oh, looks like we got him back here. There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, good deal. Good deal.
What did I miss?
We were just talking about how how Jesus looks at people, and how he sees beyond what is on the exterior. Kind of like the message that James gets across in James chapter 2. When he tells when somebody comes in, don't give them a special place just because they've got a gold ring and good clothes, but yet you treat them equal. You've become I think the King James might say a respecter of persons, or a judge of people, and that's not something that we should be. But we should be someone who kind of looks at the character of a person instead of some of the things on the outside. Because if Jesus just went by the reputation or the exterior of Zacchaeus, then we know this conversation would never happen.
Right. Well, that's as you kind of move forward, talking about the character of Zacchaeus, and how Jesus looks past it. Yeah, it reminds us to not only implement that in our own lives, but we have to also look at Zacchaeus, as you mentioned earlier, that as soon as he is in the presence of Jesus, and we know that not only, even though he went up and he's in the tree just hoping to see Jesus, but then Jesus is telling him, I'm going to your house, like I'm your guest today. And one of the issues that I guess I was working on is we recognize that Zacchaeus, he has the right mindset, that when he comes into the presence of Jesus and that communication takes place, that, I mean, there's several other New Testament examples. I believe Peter is one, when he's in the boat and he immediately says, I'm a sinful man, I'm recognizing I'm a sinful person and I'm in the presence of deity. But then when you move beyond that, I wanted to throw this at you a little bit just to see the discussion. You'd mentioned this sometime earlier, of Zacchaeus making kind of restitution. And he goes back to, you can tell that, Jesus acknowledges he's a son of Abraham, so he's Jewish, and that he did know the Jewish law, because he goes back to, I think the reference is Exodus 22:1, where it talks about the fourfold If you've taken your neighbor's oxen, then you return 5. But there's also the element of making restitution for something and repentance that we see that as you're going through that there's a big difference. It's not just meeting kind of the standard of, we can say it this way, referring to the law of Moses, but the legal side, we can make restitution. Maybe there's the law is involved, maybe it's a court case, and we can make sure to take care of the damages. But then we're going to notice that Zacchaeus goes beyond that, and he's going to pledge half of his goods. He's not just stopping in. Here was the old statement we used to joke with one another, as you've been in the formal setting with education with preachers. We have a different sense of humor.
Yeah.
But our kind of go-to sermon was, the Lord requires the minimum, and that's the thing to keep in mind. That Zacchaeus isn't saying, what's the smallest thing I have to do? But he is fully committing. He's saying, yeah, I'll make the restitution. And I appreciate, as you were pointing out, that's not a declaration of that he was a dishonest person. We're really still left in the dark. Yes, we can judge the publicans of what we know, but again, we're just gathering information on a group of people. But I believe at this point that he's saying, yes, I'll do the financial side. I'll make restitution if I have wronged anyone. He's recognizing, here I'm in the presence of God, of the Son of God. But then when we move to repentance, we must be mindful that there are times where we can go through kind of the difficulties, or maybe we get caught doing something. I'm sure all of us, so that we don't have to admit anything tonight, we'll go back to our childhood where we had to come clean, with a parent or a grandparent. Yes, we did do it, but that doesn't mean that we're going to stop doing that. That doesn't show repentance. What was it Paul wrote in Ephesians 4:28, I think? I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I think it's 4:28, where he that stole, let him steal no more. Zacchaeus had to bring himself to that point as well. It's not just as you brought up the Pharisees earlier, Jesus condemned them for just their outward showing. So Zacchaeus is going to be an example to us, because I don't believe from the account, though, as we read it, that he was just worried about, let me make this look good. Let me gather some friends because of some great act I'm going to do in front of the public. But we're seeing the true heart of an individual that's desires to be with God, wants a relationship with God, knows that he's not right with God. That's what made him climb that tree. There was that desire there, and it's very difficult for us as individuals to know when it is that we meet a Zacchaeus. That when that person is, perhaps they've already struggled and they've already beat themselves up, and then we happen to sit down by them, and that's kind of the humbling factor of reading this account.
Yeah, and Zacchaeus was someone who, like you said, he showed the desire to not only to listen to what Jesus had to say, but also to take action on it, and like you said, to go above what the minimum was, to require was required of him. And we know that being a Christian, it takes effort. It takes the ability to take action on something, and Jesus is not someone who saves someone against their will, or barges his way into a person's life. But you have to be someone that is willing to give in order to be a part of the of that kingdom. But Zacchaeus, I think it's an interesting contrast to take a look at Zacchaeus, and then take a look at another person that Jesus talked to that we refer to as, the rich young ruler. This was a man who was kind of the opposite, of Zacchaeus. He had a stellar reputation. He kept, all of the commands. Everyone probably thought he was a good guy, but yet Jesus said, you lack one thing. Go sell all that you have and give it to the poor, because Jesus knew in his heart that was the one thing that was holding him back. That was the one thing that he wasn't willing to give up in order to be a Christian. But yet here with Zacchaeus, Jesus doesn't say that to Zacchaeus, because I think he knows that all the wealth that Zacchaeus has, that's not the most important thing in his life. That's not the biggest thing to him. And so, because he is more than willing to go to these steps to restore fourfold and to give half that he has to the poor, and that's kind of interesting that's maybe the mindset that he had, and Jesus was willing to talk to him and to give him that chance to come over to the gospel.
Sure.
But we've go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, with what you were just saying, the comparison, it's a great comparison between what we call the rich young ruler and Zacchaeus. And this is, for the last several years, I've tried to kind of do my own research. I just try and look at my own life and preaching and what we're doing. And the account in Luke 19 of Zacchaeus brings out a great point. At least it's one that I'm trying to learn. And there are some times where we frustrate our own efforts because we go out with the mindset, I want to teach someone, and we try to hand select the student. This is a person I think will do, or I think will. But the beauty of this account, and one of the lessons that I'm taking out of this, I appreciate you kind of giving this assignment for the evening, as I read through it, is when we look at Jericho, the streets are crowded, all of this is going on. Here's the thought that I had. That means that someone went through that area, because this was not the first time they heard about Christ. Mm-hmm. This crowd didn't come out because they said, hey, some unknown guy is going to come through later. It's not as if he had a large group of people with him. He wasn't traveling, an all expense paid trip. They were walking the Jericho road, the same road that the Good Samaritan, that parable was delivered about. Mm-hmm. So it's a dangerous area. There's wealth, the city, all of this is going on. And what I was looking at is that instead of us handpicking our student, the preaching will pick them. Because Zacchaeus came to this scene with desire and expectations of, I want to see Jesus because I want to get right with God. So he had to have all of these lessons. Even if he disagreed with them when he heard them, even if it's taken 2 or 3 years, the preaching picked him as a student, meaning he heard God's word and he is responding to it, rather than us going, my mind goes back to Samuel when he was to anoint the next king, and David's oldest brother showed up, and Samuel said, this is it. This guy looks like a king. And we do the same. We're guilty of the same. This guy, this man or woman, they'll respond. Yes, I'm going to put my efforts here. Instead, we're just given the lesson to proclaim the word, let people know and remind them who Jesus is, and let the word do the work.
Absolutely. That's a great point, because sometimes people will, like Zacchaeus, they'll find the gospel in unexpected ways. Sometimes it's not just the most straightforward method, but sometimes it's the example of a person. It's maybe maybe an encounter that they have with a Christian. People can come to the gospel in very different ways, and that's important for us to know, to be able to sow the seed, as it were, and let God cultivate that seed in the hearts of people, and because we know He knows much more than we do, and it's but it's very important to not stop to sending out that message and letting people know. But we know that God he gives the increase, and so we can't selectively choose sometimes where we what we're going to do, but we have to be willing to just do the work for the kingdom.
Sure, sure.
We've been going right now for about 55 minutes, and so uh, do you have any closing thoughts about this story of Zacchaeus?
Uh, Probably the only thing that I would think to close with is just, um, I guess, how enriched we can be if we take time out to read back through some of those stories, accounts that maybe we talked about singing the song, and how much more just in the discussion that we've had this evening, just bringing out maybe what we forgot, or maybe just to remind ourselves of,
Mm.
oh, that's probably why we enjoyed that song. We studied that lesson that first year at VBS, and then we sang the song, and the song caught on, but maybe we forgot the lesson. So it's just I appreciate the way you're doing the lessons and the text, and bringing us back, taking our minds back to restudy and just to learn more about our Lord, and to just get to enjoy what He was here for.
I think you can always learn something from what you read in the scriptures. I always say every single bit of the Bible was put in there for a reason, for a purpose, and so it's something that we can learn from if we take the time to study it. But we so appreciate you for taking the time to be with us tonight. If somebody wants to hear more of your lessons, or see like more of your content, where can they go to find you?
We usually we have our sermons and Bible studies at the Facebook page for the Nettleton Church of Christ, uh, so they can pick us up there. And we were doing some different videos on my own personal Facebook page for a while, but we've kind of paused those for a little while. But you can always pick us up on the Nettleton Church of Christ Facebook page.
All right. Well, we want to thank you again, you so much, and I hope everyone who is watching this, we hope that this is something that has benefited you as well. And we always want to let you know that if you ever have any questions or need more explanation about something that we have said tonight, then please feel free to get in contact with us. We would love to talk to you about it. But until then, we hope that you will join us next week for another episode of the midweek Bible study. And if this is something you think would benefit somebody, then please feel free to share it with anybody that you think could use it. But until then, we will hope that you have a wonderful week, and hope you continue to go out and be the light of the world.